At my son-in-law's family. Thanksgiving dinner, his mother stood at the head of her table, looked my daughter in the eye and said, "You have no business sitting here pretending you belong. Take your casserole dish and get out of my house." Then she raised her hand. I did not argue. I put my arm around my daughter and we walked out into the cold without looking back. That night I made one phone call. By morning, everything had changed. "I am so grateful you are here. Drop a comment with your city or country, so I know where you are watching from. Also, please note this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to specific names or settings is coincidental, but the message I'm conveying to you is highly valuable." The drive from my house to the Whitfield estate took exactly 23 minutes on a good night. I knew because I had made it dozens of times over the past 6 years, always in the same truck, always wearing something that looked like I had just walked out of a lumber yard. Chloe sat beside me with a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel on her lap. She had spent 3 hours on it that afternoon, following a recipe her mother used to make every Thanksgiving before she passed. Sweet potato and brown sugar, with a crust of crushed pecans across the top. The whole truck smelled like cinnamon and butter, and I kept both hands on the wheel because it was easier than saying what I was thinking. "You think they'll say something tonight?" Chloe asked. She was not looking at me. She was watching the streetlights begin to flicker on, one by one, along the overpass. "They usually do," I said. She let out a short breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh. "I keep telling myself it doesn't bother me anymore." "Does it work?" She pressed her lips together. "Not really." I reached over and tapped the back of her hand once. That was the most either of us needed right then. Chloe was 26 years old, and she had her mother's eyes. Dark brown, patient, the kind that noticed everything but gave very little away. She had grown up in my woodshop in Gahanna, Ohio, doing homework on a workbench while I ran the planer and the jointer, learning the names of tools before she learned cursive. She was not the kind of woman who needed anyone to fight her battles. What she needed, and what I had failed to give her enough times to make me ashamed, was someone who would stand beside her when the battle started. Her husband Marcus had a way of standing just slightly behind her whenever his family said something cruel. Not quite beside her and not quite apart from her, just far enough back that no one could accuse him of doing nothing, and close enough that Chloe could not accuse him of abandoning her. It was a careful position. I had watched him practice it for 6 years without him ever realizing I was watching. Linda had texted me twice while I was loading the truck. The first message said she was already at the Whitfields and had saved us seats near the back of the dining room. The second message said to park in the side lot because the main driveway was full. I had read both messages without responding. Linda was good at logistics. She was good at a great many things that had nothing to do with love. I had married her 4 years ago, 18 months after my business attorney suggested I needed someone with social skills to accompany me to the kinds of dinners I was occasionally required to attend on behalf of my investment portfolio. That description should have told me everything. Instead, I had taken it as a reasonable starting point and convinced myself that reasonable starting points could grow into something warmer over time. I was wrong about that in ways I was only beginning to fully understand. "Dad?" Chloe's voice was quieter now. "Yeah. You don't have to come inside if you don't want to. I know how you feel about these things." I looked at my daughter. She had her mother's patience in her voice, that same steady generosity that made you feel like you were being let off the hook, even when you had done nothing wrong. It was one of the most dangerous qualities a person could have in a room full of people who confused kindness with weakness. "I want to come inside," I said. She looked at me for a moment, like she was trying to read something in my face. I kept my expression easy. I had been keeping my expression easy for 11 years, and I was very good at it by now. The Whitfield estate sat at the end of a private lane in Dublin, a northwestern suburb of Columbus, where the houses had three-car garages, and the lawns were maintained by services that arrived before dawn. The main house was a colonial revival with white columns and black shutters, and enough square footage to comfortably host a small hotel. Senator Whitfield, the patriarch, had made his money in commercial real estate development during the 90s and had spent the following 20 years turning that money into the kind of reputation that got your name on the donor wall at the Columbus Museum of Art. I pulled the Ford into the side lot as Linda had instructed. Around me, every other vehicle was a Mercedes or a Range Rover, or some variation of vehicle that cost more than most families earned in a year. An older couple near the entrance glanced at my truck, and then at each other with the particular brand of amusement that people use when they believe they are being subtle. I climbed out, buttoned my flannel over my shirt, and waited for Chloe to come around the front of the truck. She handed me the casserole dish while she straightened her coat. "How do I look?" she asked. I looked at my daughter standing in the November cold, with her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness and 11 years of my silence behind her. "Like someone they should have been nicer to a long time ago," I said. She smiled at that. A real one, not the careful version she kept ready for rooms like this. We walked toward the front door together. The gravel crunched under my boots. Through the tall front windows, I could see the warm glow of chandelier light and the movement of people dressed in things that cost more than I let on I could afford. I carried the casserole dish in both hands and wore the same expression I always wore when I walked into a room as Arthur Whitmore, retired carpenter, widower, nobody in particular. I had been nobody in particular for 11 years. I was beginning to think it was almost time to stop. The front door opened before we reached it. A member of the household staff, a young man in a white dress shirt and black vest, held it wide and nodded at us with the practiced neutrality of someone paid to treat all guests equally, regardless of what they were wearing. I appreciated that more than he knew. Inside the house was warm and bright and loud, with the particular kind of noise that money makes when it gathers. In one room, crystal glasses touching leather shoes on hardwood voices, pitched just loud enough to be heard over the next voice. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the center of the entrance hall like she had been placed there by a set designer. She was 63 years old, tall and dressed in a deep burgundy wrap dress that probably cost more than my truck's last engine rebuild. Her hair was silver and set in the kind of style that required an appointment. She wore diamond earrings that caught the chandelier light every time she turned her head, which she did often, because Eleanor Whitfield liked to make sure a room knew she was in it. She looked at Chloe first. The smile that crossed her face was the kind that used the mouth, but left the eyes entirely uninvolved. "Chloe, darling," she air-kissed somewhere near my daughter's cheek. "You look tired. Is everything all right?" Chloe's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before her own smile came up. "I'm wonderful, Eleanor, thank you." Eleanor's gaze moved to me, then traveling from my boots upward with the unhurried thoroughness of someone pricing livestock at a county fair. "Arthur," she extended one hand. "So glad you could make it." I shook her hand. Her grip was brief and boneless, the handshake of a woman who considered the gesture a formality rather than a greeting. "Thank you for having us," I said. Chloe made her mother's sweet potato casserole. Eleanor glanced at the dish in my hands with an expression that stopped just short of visible distaste. "How homey," she said, and turned back toward the dining room without offering to take it. Marcus appeared from the direction of the sitting room with a drink already in his hand. He was 31, broad-shouldered, and had the easy confidence of a man who had never once opened a bill he was worried about. He kissed Chloe on the cheek and clapped me on the arm in the way that men do when they want to appear warmer than they feel. "Arthur, good to see you." His eyes were already moving past me toward someone across the room. "There's bourbon at the bar. Help yourself." I told him I would. He was gone before I finished the sentence. Chloe watched him go with an expression she recovered from quickly. I pretended not to notice. That was something else I had been doing for 6 years, pretending not to notice the small collapses she patched over before anyone else could see them. The dining room held 4 round tables, each set for 10, with centerpieces of white chrysanthemums and polished gourds and small battery-powered candles that flickered without producing any real warmth. Senator Whitfield, a broad man in his late 60s with white hair and a handshake like a campaign stop, found me near the bar and spent 4 minutes telling me about a development project he was backing in the short North District of Columbus. He used the word leverage 3 times. I nodded at appropriate intervals and did not mention that Blackwood Capital held a significant position in the financing structure of that same project. Linda materialized at my elbow midway through the senator's monologue. She was dressed in navy blue and had her dark hair pinned up in a way that suited the room considerably better than it suited her usual style. She touched my arm and smiled at the senator and inserted herself into the conversation with the fluid precision of someone who had rehearsed the move. I watched her work and felt the familiar numbness that had replaced whatever I used to feel when I looked at her. The dinner began with soup and rolls and the usual circuits of compliments and comparisons. Marcus sat at the far end of the table from Chloe, which I noted without comment. Across from me, a woman named Patricia, some kind of cousin to Eleanor, spent 20 minutes describing her recent trip to the Amalfi Coast. Beside her, a man in a sport coat laughed too loudly at everything Senator Whitfield said. Then Eleanor turned toward me from 3 seats away. "Arthur." Her voice carried easily over the table noise. Several heads turned. "What exactly is it that you do again with the wood?" The table settled into the kind of quiet that waits for something. I set down my fork and looked at Eleanor Whitfield with the same easy expression I had been wearing all evening. Around me, I could feel the particular attention of people who smelled the possibility of entertainment. "Custom furniture mostly," I said. "Some restoration work, whatever comes through the shop." Eleanor tilted her head. "And that keeps you busy at your age?" A soft ripple of amusement moved around the table. Marcus studied his wine glass. Linda smoothed the napkin in her lap without looking up. Chloe's hand moved under the table and found the edge of her chair. "Busy enough," I said pleasantly. Eleanor smiled. "Well, I suppose everyone finds their level." She turned back to the woman beside her and resumed a conversation about a charity auction. The ripple of amusement faded. The silverware started moving again. Chloe looked straight ahead, with her mother's careful patience stretched across her face like a bandage over something that had not stopped bleeding. I picked up my fork and cut a piece of ham and thought about a phone number I had memorized 11 years ago and had never once needed to use in anger. That was about to change. The conversation that started it was not loud. That was the thing about the way Eleanor Whitfield operated. She did not need volume. She had spent decades perfecting the art of the quiet wound, the comment delivered in a dinner party voice that left a bruise no one could point to afterward. What happened that evening began the same way, with a remark so casually cruel that half the table probably missed it entirely. Marcus had been holding court at his end of the table, talking about a rezoning proposal his father was backing near Worthington. He used the word visionary twice in 4 sentences. Chloe, who had been quiet for most of the meal, set down her glass and said mildly, and without any particular edge, that the neighborhood association in that area had serious concerns about displacement of working families. The table did not go quiet immediately. It went careful. Marcus looked at his wife the way a man looks at something that has spoken out of turn. Chloe. Just her name. A warning wrapped in 2 syllables. "I'm just saying what I read," Chloe said. Her voice was steady. People who have lived there for 30 years are being pushed out so that nobody asked what you read. Eleanor's voice came from the head of the table, smooth and unhurried the way a blade sounds before it connects. And frankly, nobody at this table needs a lecture on community development from a girl who grew up in a woodshop. Chloe's fork stopped moving. Around the table, people found reasons to look at their plates. Senator Whitfield cleared his throat. Linda lifted her wine glass and took a long sip without making eye contact with anyone. Marcus leaned back in his chair and crossed one arm over his chest and said absolutely nothing. Chloe raised her eyes and looked directly at Eleanor. I was just sharing a perspective. A perspective. Eleanor repeated the word like it tasted sour. She set her own fork down with a small, precise click. Your perspective, my dear, comes from a woman whose father smells like sawdust and machine oil and has no business sitting at a table like this, pretending he belongs here. She let that land. Then she pushed back her chair and stood. I have been tolerant of this arrangement for 6 years. I have smiled through the casseroles and the flannel shirts and the working-class dignity routine. But I will not sit in my own dining room and be lectured about community values by someone who does not have the breeding or the education to understand what she is talking about. The room had gone completely still. Chloe stood up from her chair. Her face had drained of color, but her chin was up and her shoulders were straight, and she was every inch her mother's daughter. Eleanor, that is enough. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Eleanor stepped around the corner of the table. Her right hand came across in a sharp arc and connected with Chloe's left cheek with a crack that cut through the silence of the room like something breaking that could not be repaired. Chloe's head snapped to the side. Her hand flew up to her face. Her eyes filled immediately, not with sadness, but with the stunned animal shock of someone who has just been struck in a place they believed was safe. 40 people held their breath. Eleanor straightened. Her voice dropped to something low and vicious. You will not raise your voice in my home. Either of you. Her eyes moved to me then, and they were flat and certain and completely without remorse. Take your daughter and your casserole dish and get out of my house before I call security. I was already standing. I did not look at Marcus, who had not moved from his chair. I did not look at Linda, whose eyes were fixed on the tablecloth, with an expression I would think about later. I walked the length of that dining room without hurrying, because hurrying would have suggested I was rattled, and I was not rattled. I was the opposite of rattled. I was the stillest I had been in years. I put my arm around Chloe's shoulders and felt her shaking beneath my hand. I leaned down close to her ear. Keep walking, I said quietly. Don't look back. She kept walking. We went through the entrance hall and out the front door and down the gravel drive in the cold November air. Behind us, the house hummed with the low, urgent sound of 40 people exhaling at once and reaching for something to say. I opened the passenger door and helped Chloe inside. She pressed both hands against her cheek and stared straight through the windshield. Her breath came in short, uneven pulls. I closed the door. I walked around to the driver's side. I stood for a moment in the dark beside my truck, with the cold settling into my collar and the gravel quiet under my boots. Then I reached into my coat pocket and took out my phone. The cold came in fast off the open lot, the kind of Ohio November cold that gets under your collar and stays there. My breath made small clouds in the dark air. Somewhere behind me, through the tall windows of the Whitfield house, I could see the shapes of people moving, the muted glow of chandelier light, the slow reorganization of a dinner party after something has gone wrong, and everyone is pretending it has not. I looked at my phone. One contact. Listed under the initials TW, I had programmed it that way 11 years ago and never changed it. I pressed call. It rang once. Mr. Whitmore? Thomas Webb's voice was the same as it always was, measured and low, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where the wrong word cost millions. He was 61 years old, a former partner at one of Columbus's oldest corporate law firms, and for the past 11 years he had served as the sole legal representative and operating trustee of Blackwood Capital Management, a private investment trust registered in Delaware with holdings across commercial real estate, municipal bonds, and structured credit facilities in central Ohio. Nobody outside of Thomas and two CPAs knew that Arthur Whitmore, retired carpenter of Gahanna, Ohio, was the trust's founding principal and its only beneficiary. That was the arrangement I had built carefully and deliberately, one layer at a time, over more than a decade. Thomas, I said, step 1, tonight. A pause of exactly 2 seconds. Understood. I'll need until morning for the credit facility recall. The tax audit referral I can initiate within the hour. The hour is fine. Are you all right, sir? I looked through the passenger window at Chloe. She had both hands pressed flat against her thighs and was staring at the dashboard with the fixed concentration of someone trying very hard to hold themselves together. The mark on her cheek was already visible from where I stood, a deep flush spreading from her cheekbone toward her jaw. No, I said, but I will be. I'll send confirmation when step 1 is complete. Thank you, Thomas. I ended the call and stood there for another moment in the cold. Let me explain what step 1 meant, because it was not complicated, though it would feel that way to the people on the receiving end of it. Blackwood Capital held through a series of intermediary funds approximately 40% of the outstanding debt instruments financing Senator Whitfield's current development portfolio in central Ohio. The senator's company had borrowed against projected revenue from 3 separate projects, all of which were structured through a private credit facility that Blackwood controlled as the senior lender. Senior lenders have rights that junior lenders do not. They can accelerate repayment schedules. They can trigger audit clauses. They can, under certain contract conditions, refer accounts for independent financial review, which has the practical effect of freezing the borrower's ability to draw on existing credit lines until the review is complete. None of this was illegal. None of it was even unusual in commercial lending. It was simply the application of rights that had existed in the contract from the beginning, rights that Senator Whitfield's attorneys had reviewed and signed off on years ago without imagining they would ever be exercised. They had never imagined them being exercised because they had never imagined that the man across the Thanksgiving table in the flannel shirt was the one holding them. I put the phone in my pocket and got into the truck. Chloe turned toward me the moment I closed the door. Her eyes were dry now, which told me more about how hard she was working than tears would have. Who did you call? An old friend. Dad. Her voice had an edge to it that was not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it, the tone of a person who suspects they are being managed. Who did you call? I started the engine. The heater came on low and pushed cold air for a moment before it began to warm. Someone who can help, I said. That's all you need right now. She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, a couple was leaving the Whitfield house, the woman pulling her coat tight, the man glancing toward my truck and then away. Chloe watched them go. He didn't say a word, she said quietly. Marcus. He sat there and watched her do it, and he didn't say a single word. I kept my hands on the steering wheel and my eyes on the windshield. I know. I kept waiting. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard and looked out the side window. The whole time she was talking, I kept waiting for him to say something. Anything. I know, sweetheart. Why didn't he? I did not have an answer that would help her tonight. The true answer was that Marcus Whitfield had never once in 6 years placed Chloe's dignity above his own comfort, and I had watched it happen enough times to know it was not going to change. But that was a truth she needed to arrive at herself in her own time, and tonight was not that time. "Let's get you home," I said. "Ah, whoa." She nodded once and turned back toward the windshield. I pulled out of the lot and onto the dark road heading south toward Gahanna. We drove for several minutes without speaking. The heater had warmed up properly by then, and the cab of the old truck felt close and safe the way small spaces do on cold nights. My phone buzzed once on the seat between us. A text from Thomas. 3 words. Step 1 complete. I left it face down and kept driving. Somewhere behind us, in a house full of crystal and chandelier light, someone's phone was beginning to ring with news they were not going to understand for a very long time. We got home a little after 10. Chloe had stopped talking somewhere on Route 62 and had spent the last 15 minutes of the drive with her forehead resting against the cold passenger window, watching the dark Ohio farmland slide past without really seeing it. When I pulled into the driveway, she climbed out before I had fully stopped and went straight inside without waiting for me, which told me she needed the bathroom mirror and a few minutes alone more than she needed anything I could offer her right then. I sat in the truck for a moment after she went in. The engine ticked as it cooled. The neighborhood was quiet, the way suburbs get quiet on holiday nights. Every house glowing from the inside. Every family sealed into its own warmth. I thought about Eleanor Whitfield's face in the moment after the slap, the absolute absence of regret in it. And I felt something settle in my chest that was not anger and not grief, but something colder and more permanent than either. Inside, Linda was already home. She was in the kitchen in her robe, filling a glass of water at the sink, and she turned when I came through the door with the particular expression of a person who has been waiting and does not want to appear to have been waiting. "How is she?" Linda asked. "She'll be all right." Linda set the glass down. "Eleanor went too far tonight. Even I could see that." I hung my coat on the hook by the door and did not say anything. "I should have said something at the table," Linda continued. Her voice had the careful texture of a person constructing an apology rather than feeling one. I froze. I don't know why, I just froze. I looked at my wife of 4 years standing in our kitchen in her robe, and I thought about the way she had lifted her wine glass during Eleanor's speech slowly and deliberately, the way a person does when they want something to do with their hands that will excuse them from having to act. It was not the gesture of someone who had frozen. It was the gesture of someone who had chosen. "It's late," I said. "Get some sleep." Something moved across her face. Disappointment, maybe, or the performance of it. "Arthur." "Good night, Linda." She picked up her water glass and went upstairs. I listened to her footsteps cross the ceiling above me and heard the bedroom door close with a softness that was somehow worse than if she had slammed it. I made coffee. I did not want coffee, but I needed something to do with my hands while I thought, and making coffee was the kind of task that kept the hands busy without requiring the mind. I stood at the counter while it brewed and opened my phone to the update Thomas had sent 40 minutes earlier. The message was 2 paragraphs. The first confirmed that the credit acceleration notice had been formally issued to Senator Whitfield's primary lender, triggering an independent audit requirement under Section 14 of the original loan covenant. In practical terms, this meant the senator's company could not draw on any existing credit lines until the audit was resolved, a process that typically took between 30 and 90 days. The second paragraph noted that 3 of the senator's key development partners had already received notification of the audit referral, and that 2 of them had responded within the hour by requesting a review of their own exposure. Thomas had added 1 line at the bottom in his precise, unornamented style. "They will begin making calls by morning." No one will answer. I read it twice and put the phone face down on the counter. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured a cup and carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. The house was quiet around me except for the furnace cycling on and off in the basement and the occasional creak of the old house settling in the cold. I thought about Senator Whitfield at his dining room table right now, or maybe already on the phone, his big campaign stop voice stripped of its confidence, trying to reach people who were suddenly unavailable. I did not feel satisfaction exactly. What I felt was closer to the particular exhaustion that comes after years of carrying something heavy and finally setting it down. Not relief, just the absence of weight. The ceiling creaked above me. Linda's side of the bedroom near the window. I noted it without expression. My phone lit up on the counter. Not Thomas this time. A number I did not recognize, though the Columbus area code told me enough. I watched it ring 4 times and go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Same number. I turned the phone face down again and drank my coffee. Chloe appeared in the kitchen doorway in the oversized sweatshirt she had been wearing around the house since college. Her face was clean and her hair was pulled back, and the mark on her cheek had deepened to a bruise the color of a rain cloud. She looked younger than 26 and older at the same time. "Can't sleep," she said. "Me neither. Sit down." She pulled out the chair across from me and sat with both hands wrapped around her elbows. I got up and poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her, and she held it without drinking, letting the warmth come through the ceramic into her palms. "Dad." She looked up at me. "What's going to happen?" I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table, at the bruise on her face and the steadiness in her eyes that she had gotten from her mother, and I thought about a file on Thomas's computer that contained 11 years of financial records, 3 months of investigative reports, and 1 toxicology analysis that I had not yet decided what to do with. "Things are going to change," I said. She searched my face for something more specific. I held her gaze and gave her what I could, which was the truth in its simplest form, and waited for morning to do the rest. The first call came at 3:17 in the morning. I was still at the kitchen table. The coffee had gone cold an hour earlier, and I had not bothered to reheat it. Chloe had finally gone to bed around midnight, after I told her twice that rest was the most useful thing she could do, and meant it both times. The house had been quiet since then, except for the wind picking up outside and the occasional creak of the old oak in the backyard bending against it. The phone screen lit up the kitchen. The name on it was Marcus. I let it ring. 4 rings, 5, 6. It went to voicemail. I watched the screen go dark and picked up my cold coffee and drank it anyway. 90 seconds later, it rang again. Marcus again. I set the cup down and answered it. "Arthur." His voice was unrecognizable from the man who had clapped me on the arm 8 hours earlier. The easy confidence was gone, stripped down to something raw and slightly breathless, the voice of a man who had been on the phone for hours and was running out of people to call. "Arthur, I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening." "Something is happening with my father's company. The bank called tonight some kind of audit. They're saying all the credit lines are frozen and nobody can explain why, and my father is—" He stopped, pulled himself together. "Look, I know tonight was bad. My mother went too far. I know that. But right now I need you to—" "Marcus." I kept my voice level and unhurried. "Why are you calling me—" A pause. "Because Chloe won't answer her phone. Chloe is asleep. Then wake her up. Please. I need her to come home. If she comes home and we present a united front to the bank, then maybe—" "Stop." I said it the way you say it to someone who is heading towards something they cannot see. "Listen to what you're asking. Your mother put her hand across your wife's face in front of 40 people. You sat in your chair and watched it happen. And now at 3 in the morning you want me to wake my daughter up so she can help save your family's credit line. The silence on his end had a texture to it, the particular quality of a person who knows they have been seen clearly and has no answer for it. "I didn't know she was going to do that," he said finally. His voice had dropped. "My mother, I didn't know." "I believe you." "I did, actually." "That doesn't change what you did afterward." "Arthur, You had 6 years of afterward, Marcus. 6 years of dinners and comments and quiet little cruelties, and every single time you found somewhere else to look. Tonight was the same as every other night, except that this time she used her hand instead of her words." He did not speak. Somewhere on his end I could hear a television on low, the murmur of a news channel, someone else in the room shifting their weight. "Is your father there?" I asked. "Yes." "And your mother?" She's here. Put her on." Another pause, longer this time, filled with muffled voices and what sounded like a brief argument. Then Eleanor's voice came on the line, and the first thing I noticed was that it had lost its dinner party smoothness entirely. What was left underneath was older and less certain, and considerably more afraid. "Arthur." She said my name like she was testing whether it still worked. "I want you to understand that what happened tonight was completely out of character for me. I have been under an enormous amount of stress with the business and the holidays, and I simply, Mrs. Whitfield." I cut through it cleanly. "I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to hang up. Are you listening?" A sharp intake of breath. "Yes. My daughter is not a door that you open and close whenever it suits you. She is not a problem you manage or a situation you contain. She is a person, and what you did to her tonight in your dining room was not stress. It was a choice, and choices have consequences." I paused for exactly one beat. "Good night." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows with a low, steady pressure. I sat with my hands flat on the table and let the quiet settle around me and thought about nothing in particular for a long moment. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. Light ones, careful, the footsteps of someone trying not to be heard. Linda appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe, her hair loose, her face arranged into an expression of sleepy concern that did not quite reach her eyes. "Who was that?" she asked. "Marcus." Then Eleanor. She came into the kitchen and pulled out the chair across from me, the one Chloe had been sitting in an hour earlier, and sat down with her hands folded on the table. Her eyes moved to my phone and then back to my face. "What did they want?" "What people always want when they've broken something," I said, "for someone else to fix it." Linda nodded slowly. Her fingers moved against each other on the tabletop, a small, restless motion she made when she was thinking hard about something she did not intend to say out loud. I had noticed it before. I had catalogued a great many things about Linda over 4 years without letting on that I had noticed any of them. "Are you going to help them?" she asked. I looked at my wife across the kitchen table in the 3 o'clock quiet of our house, and I felt the distance between us like a physical thing, a cold draft coming through a gap I had spent too long pretending was not there. "No," I said. Her fingers stopped moving. Just for a second. Then they started again. "I see," she said. She got up, said good night, in a voice that meant nothing, and went back upstairs. I listened to her footsteps cross the ceiling. I listened to her stop at the far end of the bedroom near the window, the same spot she had stopped earlier. I sat with that for a while. Then I reached for my phone, opened a new message to Thomas, and typed 4 words. "Check the window side." I hit send and went to bed. The flowers arrived on a Tuesday. 24 white roses in a crystal vase delivered by a florist from a shop in the short north that charged the kind of prices that assumed the buyer was not checking the total. The card tucked into the arrangement said in Marcus's handwriting that he was sorry, and that he loved her, and that none of what had happened was what he wanted. Chloe read it standing in the front hallway in her socks, and then carried the vase to the kitchen counter and stood looking at it for a long time without touching it again. I was in the garage sharpening a set of chisels when she came to find me. "Marcus sent flowers," she said from the doorway. I kept the chisel moving against the whetstone. I saw the truck. She leaned against the doorframe, with her arms crossed and her chin tucked down the posture she had used since she was 12 years old, when she was working through something she had not yet decided how to say. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish green, at the edges still visible if you knew where to look. "He's been calling every day," she said. 3-4 times. He leaves these long voicemails. He keeps saying his mother is getting help, that she's seeing someone, a therapist, that the whole family is in counseling now." She paused. "He sounds different, quieter." I set the chisel down and picked up the next one. "Different how?" "Like he means it." She looked at the floor. "Or like he wants to." That distinction mattered more than she realized, and I was glad she had made it herself. There was a version of this conversation where I told her exactly what I knew about Marcus Whitfield and what kind of man he had shown himself to be across 6 years of careful observation. There was another version where I said nothing and let her find her own way to the truth. I had been turning those two versions over in my mind for days, and I still had not fully decided which one served her better. "He wrote me a letter," she said. "An actual letter, not an email, handwritten 4 pages. "What did it say?" She unfolded a piece of paper from the pocket of her sweatshirt. She had been carrying it with her, I realized, for at least part of the day. She cleared her throat and read aloud, her voice steady at first, and then less so as she moved through it. Marcus wrote about the night of the dinner with what sounded like genuine shame. He wrote about his mother's temper and his own failure to stand between it and his wife. He wrote about the business difficulties and said they were serious but manageable, and that none of it was Chloe's responsibility to fix. Then Chloe stopped reading and folded the letter back along its creases and put it in her pocket. "That's most of it," she said. I waited. She looked up at me. "Dad, do you think people can actually change, not just say they will, actually do it?" I put the chisel down on the workbench and gave the question the weight it deserved. Outside, a car moved slowly down our street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the garage wall. "Some people can," I said carefully. "The ones who understand what they're changing and why. Not the ones who are changing because something got taken away from them." She thought about that. "How do you tell the difference?" "Read the letter again," I said. "More carefully this time. Count how many times he apologizes for what his mother did to you. Then count how many times he mentions the business." She pulled the letter back out of her pocket. Her eyes moved across the page. I watched her face change as she read, a subtle recalibration happening behind her eyes, the expression of someone who has just seen a familiar object from an unfamiliar angle. She folded the letter slowly and held it in both hands. "Once," she said quietly. "He apologizes for Mom once, right at the beginning. Then it's 3 pages about the company." She looked up, and the hurt in her face was the clean, honest kind, the kind that comes not from surprise but from confirmation. "He never once mentioned the mark on my face." I picked up my chisel again, because I needed something to do with my hands. "Dad." Her voice was smaller now. "Why didn't he mention it?" I looked at my daughter standing in the garage doorway, with her mother's eyes and a fading bruise on her cheek, and a 4-page letter in her hands that had managed to say almost nothing about the most important thing. Because to him, I said quietly, it wasn't the most important thing. She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling and blinked several times rapidly. She was not going to cry in front of me, which was a decision I recognized because her mother used to make the same one in the same way. "Okay," she said finally, in a voice that meant the opposite. She went back inside. I listened to the door close behind her and sat down on the workbench stool and stared at the chisel in my hand. In my study in the locked bottom drawer of my desk, a brown envelope had been sitting for 3 months. Inside it was information that would answer every question Chloe had not yet thought to ask. I was not ready to give it to her yet. But I was getting there. The woodshop had been mine since before Chloe was born. It occupied the back half of a detached garage on the far side of the property, separated from the house by a stretch of dormant winter lawn that I crossed every morning the way other men crossed to a coffee maker. The smell of it hit you at the doorwood resin and linseed oil and the faint metallic edge of saw blade, and it was the one smell in my life that had never once been complicated. Everything else I owned or had built or decided over 70 years carried some weight of ambivalence. The woodshop never did. I had been in there for 2 hours that morning running a cabinet door through the planer when Thomas called. I killed the machine and picked up. "Tell me." "The window side," Thomas said, "is more interesting than we anticipated." He paused in the way he did when he was selecting words carefully. "I received the preliminary report from our investigator this morning. I think you should come to the office." "Give me the short version." Another pause. "The short version is that your instinct was correct. The longer version requires the file." I set the cabinet door down on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. Straight grain, no knots, clean cut. The kind of piece that did exactly what you expected it to do. "Tomorrow morning," I said. 9 o'clock. I'll have everything ready." I put the phone in my shirt pocket and stood in the quiet of the shop. Dust motes moved in the thin winter light coming through the high window above the bench. I picked up a hand plane and turned it over, feeling the weight of it, and thought about a woman named Ruth. Ruth Eleanor Whitmore had been 44 years old when the doctors found the tumor. She had been 46 when she died on a Wednesday morning in March, with Chloe asleep in the chair beside her bed, and my hand in hers and the particular slant of early spring light coming through the hospital window that I have never been able to look at directly since. She had been a civil engineer by training and a maker of things by nature, the kind of woman who fixed what was broken and built what was missing, and asked for very little in return except honesty and strong coffee. She had made me promise 2 things in the last weeks of her life. The first was that I would make sure Chloe finished college. The second was harder. We were sitting together on the back porch one evening, late enough that the yard had gone dark and the fireflies were out, and Ruth had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she was not drinking, and she looked at me with the direct, unhurried gaze she had always used when she was about to say something true. "Arthur." Her voice was thin by then, but her eyes were the same as they had always been. "When Chloe finds someone, don't let the money be the reason." I told her I did not understand. "Don't let her be chosen for what you've built," she said. "Let her be chosen for who she is. Make sure you can tell the difference." I had thought about those words more times than I could count in the 11 years since. They were the reason I had driven a 12-year-old Ford truck to every family dinner and worn flannel shirts and deflected every question about my finances with a vague reference to the woodshop. Not because I was ashamed of what I had built, because Ruth had been right, as she almost always was, and the only way to know if someone loved Chloe for Chloe was to make sure they never saw anything else. The problem, which I had understood for at least 3 years, was that I had waited too long to tell Chloe herself. She did not know about Blackwood Capital. She did not know that the trust her father had built across 20 years of careful investment controlled significant positions in commercial real estate throughout central Ohio. She did not know that the man who drove her to Thanksgiving dinner in a rusted pickup had a net worth that would have made Senator Whitfield considerably more careful about his dinner table manners. I had kept it from her for the right reasons and held on to it past the point where those reasons still applied, which was a failure I intended to correct. But first there was the matter of the envelope. 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning in August, I had asked Thomas to retain a private investigator named Gerald Foss, a former IRS agent, who had spent 15 years in financial crimes before opening his own practice in Columbus. I had given Gerald 2 assignments. The first was to examine the Whitfield family's corporate tax structure, which I had long suspected was optimistic in ways that would not survive scrutiny. The second came from a smaller and more private concern. A series of observations I had made over 2 years that I had not spoken aloud to anyone. Linda took walks on Thursday evenings that lasted between 90 minutes and 2 hours. She always took her personal cell phone, not the one we shared a plan on. She always changed clothes before she left and changed back when she returned. She always came back in a different kind of quiet, not the quiet of someone who had been walking, but the quiet of someone who had been somewhere they were not going to mention. Gerald had followed her on 4 separate Thursdays. His report was thorough and documented, and included photographs and phone records. What those records showed was not a stranger. The man Linda had been meeting on those Thursday evenings was Marcus Whitfield, my son-in-law, Chloe's husband. They had been meeting at a hotel on the west side of Columbus for at least 14 months, possibly longer. Gerald believed it started before that, but could only document what he could document. Separate from that, Gerald's financial analysis had identified a pattern of transfers. Linda had been moving money from a joint account I had not closely monitored. The transfers did not correspond to any household expense I could account for. When I traced where the money was going, it was going to the same place Marcus had been quietly routing funds from 3 accounts Chloe knew nothing about. Both streams were feeding a single offshore account registered in the Bahamas, under a shell entity neither of them had mentioned to anyone. When I laid the 2 findings side by side, the picture they made was one I had been half expecting and still did not want to see. They were not just conducting an affair. They were building a way out. Together. I had read the report once on the morning it arrived. Then I had put it in the brown envelope and locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk and not opened it again. Not because I doubted it. Because I needed to decide what to do with it, and some decisions deserve more than one morning. I set the handplane back on its hook and looked at the cabinet door on the bench. Tomorrow I would go to Thomas's office. Tonight I would finish the door. Some things at least were still that simple. Before I reveal the dark secret inside that envelope and how this confrontation dropped, please comment on the number 100 below to let me know you are still here with me. Also, a quick reminder, the next part of this story features some fictional elements and may not be completely factual, so if you prefer not to listen to this kind of narrative, you are welcome to turn off the video right here. The morning was ordinary in the way that mornings before difficult things sometimes are. I was up at 5:45, the same as always, and had the coffee going, before the sky outside the kitchen window had fully decided between dark and gray. The thermometer on the back porch read 21 degrees. A cardinal was working the bird feeder I had put up the previous winter, the only spot of color in the yard, and I watched it through the glass while the coffee brewed, and thought about nothing in particular, with the focused intentionality of a man who knows he is about to think about something very particular indeed. I had been to Thomas's office the day before. I had sat across from him at his conference table for 2 hours with Gerald Foss's complete report open in front of me, reading through the sections I had not yet read and rereading the sections I had. Gerald was thorough in the way that former federal agents tend to be thorough, which is to say he documented everything and assumed nothing and let the facts carry the weight without helping them along. By the time I left Thomas's office, I had the full picture, and the full picture was worse than the partial one had been, not in its details, which I had largely anticipated, but in its scope, which I had not. I poured my coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and placed the brown envelope in the center of it. It was a standard 9 by 12 craft envelope, the kind you could buy in any office supply store, and it contained 114 pages of documents, photographs, financial records, and investigative notes. Gerald had organized it into 4 sections with color-coded tabs. The first section covered the Whitfield family's corporate tax structure across 7 years. The second covered Marcus specifically, his personal finances, his spending patterns, and 3 accounts that did not appear on any joint filing with Chloe. The third section was the one I had read last and thought about most. I heard Chloe's footsteps on the stairs at 7:15. She came into the kitchen in her sweatshirt and her wool socks. Her hair loose, her face carrying the particular heaviness of someone who had slept, but not rested. She stopped when she saw the envelope on the table. "Good morning," I said. She looked at the envelope and then at me. "What is that?" "Sit down first. Have some coffee." She sat. I poured her a cup and set it in front of her, and she wrapped both hands around it and waited with her eyes on the envelope the way you watch something you are not sure is safe to touch. "Dad," her voice was careful, "you're scaring me a little." "I know. I'm sorry." I sat down across from her. "I've been holding on to this for 3 months trying to decide the right time. I don't think there is a right time for something like this. There's just the time when not telling you becomes worse than telling you." She set her coffee down. "What's in it?" "Information. Some of it you're going to be able to look at and accept fairly quickly. Some of it is going to take longer." I paused. "All of it is true. Gerald Foss, the investigator who compiled it, spent 15 years as a special agent with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division before he went private. He does not make mistakes, and he does not embellish. Everything in that envelope has a source document behind it." Chloe looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she reached out and picked it up. She opened the clasp and pulled the contents out in a neat stack and set the envelope aside. She was systematic about it, which was something she had gotten from her mother, this habit of organizing, before processing, giving herself a moment of order before letting the content land. She looked at the color-coded tabs and then at me. "Should I start at the beginning?" "Yes." She turned to the first section. I watched her read. She was a fast reader, always had been, and her face as she moved through the first pages of the tax analysis was focused and careful, a slight furrow between her brows that deepened as she turned pages. Partway through the second section, she stopped and went back and reread something. Her jaw tightened. "These accounts," she said, "these 3 accounts in Marcus's name, they're not joint." "No, we have joint accounts. We filed jointly last year. He told me—" She stopped, pressed 2 fingers against her mouth. "He told me we had combined everything." "I know what he told you." She kept reading. Her coffee sat untouched beside her, and the cardinal outside came back to the feeder and left again, and the kitchen stayed quiet, except for the sound of pages turning and the furnace cycling on in the basement. Then she reached the third section. She turned the first page and went still. Not the stillness of someone reading, The stillness of someone who has just stepped onto ice and is waiting to find out whether it will hold. Her hands gripped the edges of the pages. She did not make a sound. She simply read, and I watched her face do the work that faces do when the mind is processing something it did not want to be true. Her jaw tightened. Her breathing changed. She turned one page, then another, and the color in her face went slowly and completely away. "Dad?" Her voice was quiet and flat, the voice she used when she was working very hard to hold herself together. "This is Linda. And Marcus." "Yes." She did not say anything for a moment. Her eyes stayed on the pages, and I watched her read the same line twice the way you reread something when your mind refuses to accept it the first time. "They have been meeting," she said. Not a question. Just a woman confirming aloud what her eyes were telling her. "Gerald documented 14 months. He believes it started before that." She set the section down on the table, with both hands, very carefully, the way you set down something fragile that has already broken. "And the accounts," she said finally. "The transfers. Linda has been moving money from our joint account. The transfers correspond to a separate account I was not aware of. Gerald traced it." I paused. "Marcus has been doing the same thing on his end. 3 accounts in his name that were never disclosed to you. The money from both sides has been accumulating in a single offshore account in the Bahamas." I let that land for a moment. Neither of them intended to be here when it was time to use it. They were not just conducting an affair. They were planning to disappear together. She absorbed that without speaking. Outside, the cardinal came back to the feeder. The furnace cycled on in the basement. Then she pushed back her chair and stood up, and the pages fell from her hands and scattered across the kitchen floor, and she walked out of the kitchen without looking back, and I heard the front door open. She did not cry out at me. She did not accuse me of lying. She simply had to see it for herself, because that was the kind of woman she was, and I had known from the moment I put the envelope on the table that this was how it would end. I picked up my keys from the hook by the door and followed her. Her car was already at the end of the block by the time I got the truck started. A silver Honda Civic, 7 years old, that she had bought herself with money saved from 3 years of teaching assistant work at Ohio State. I had offered to help her buy something newer twice, and she had declined twice in the polite, firm way she had of declining things she wanted to handle herself. I pulled out of the driveway and kept her taillights in sight, without closing the distance between us, hanging back far enough that she would not see me in her mirror if she was not looking for me. She was not looking for me. She was driving the way people drive when their hands are moving on the wheel, but their mind is somewhere else entirely. A little fast for the residential streets, taking the corners with more certainty than caution. I knew where she was going, because there was only one place she could be going, and I knew why she needed to go there herself rather than taking my word for what was in those pages, because she was 26 years old, and she had loved Marcus Whitfield for 4 of those years, and love does not release its hold simply because a document tells it to. We picked up Route 161 heading northwest toward Dublin, and the December morning opened up around us into flat gray sky and bare trees, and the particular emptiness of Ohio farmland, in winter-brown fields running to the horizon, with nothing decorative about them, just land being what land is when nothing is growing. I kept 2 cars of distance between us on the highway and called Thomas. He picked up on the first ring. "Mr. Whitmore, we're moving earlier than planned," I said. "She's on her way to the Whitfield house." A brief pause. "How much earlier?" 20 minutes, maybe less. The federal warrant was signed yesterday afternoon." Thomas said, his voice shifting into the clipped precision he used when timelines compressed. "I can have the agents at the property within 45 minutes of your call. The warrant covers the premises and all financial records on site. It was issued under Title 26 of the United States Code, which governs tax crimes. The agents have authority to detain anyone found in the act of removing or concealing documents or assets subject to the investigation. Make the call, Thomas. Already dialing, sir. He paused once more. Be careful. I set the phone on the seat and watched Chloe's taillights ahead of me on the highway. Title 26 warrants. I knew from my years working alongside Thomas on Blackwood's legal structure were among the most comprehensive search authorities available to federal investigators. They did not require proof of a specific crime already committed, only probable cause to believe that tax fraud had occurred or was ongoing. Gerald Foss's documentation had given Thomas more than enough probable cause. The warrant had been waiting signed and ready for 3 days. We had simply been waiting for the right moment to use it. The right moment had apparently decided to choose itself. Chloe turned off Route 161 onto the private lane leading to the Whitfield estate, and I followed at a distance, cutting my headlights as I turned in because the lane was straight, and she would have seen them in her mirror. The morning light was enough to drive by. I watched her park at an angle near the front entrance, not in the side lot, where we had been directed on Thanksgiving, and get out of the car without looking back. She still had her house key. I had not thought about that until I watched her reach into her coat pocket and pull it out. She let herself in through the front door, and it closed behind her. I pulled the truck to a stop 30 yards back and sat with the engine running. The house looked different in winter daylight than it had in Thanksgiving evening warmth. The grounds were bare, the ornamental plantings cut back to stubs, the fountain near the entrance dry and covered with a tarp. The white columns looked less stately in gray morning light, and more like what they actually were, a very expensive set decoration for a family that had confused the appearance of solidity with the real thing. I watched the windows. For 2 minutes, nothing moved. Then a light came on in an upstairs room on the right side of the house. Then another. Then a figure moved past the window quickly, and I could not tell from the distance whether it was Chloe or someone else, but the movement had the particular urgency of someone who had just been surprised. I called Thomas. How long, sir? 30 minutes. They were further out than expected. Understood. I put the phone down and kept watching the windows. The upstairs light was still on. No voices carried from inside, or if they did, the distance swallowed them. The bare trees along the lane moved in a cold wind that rocked the truck gently on its suspension. Then, from somewhere inside the house on the upper floor, came a sound that traveled clearly through the winter air and reached me through the closed windows of the truck. My daughter's voice. Not words. Just the raw animal sound of someone who has just seen something they cannot unsee. A cry that started high and broke in the middle and cost her something to make. My hand was on the door handle before the sound finished. I was out of the truck and moving across the gravel before I had decided to move, the cold air hitting my face and my boots finding the ground, and the front door of the Whitfield house getting larger with every stride. It was not locked. Chloe had not closed it fully behind her, and it swung inward under my hand, and I was inside and taking the stairs 2 at a time before the door had finished moving. The upper hallway was lit and empty. At the far end, the door to the master bedroom stood open. I went toward it. The door to the master bedroom was open 8 inches. I stopped in the hallway and put my hand flat against it and pushed it the rest of the way. What I saw on the other side took me a half second to organize into meaning, the way your eyes sometimes need a moment to catch up with a scene they were not prepared for. The room was in a state of controlled urgency. 2 large suitcases lay open on the bed, both of them already half-filled, clothes and shoes, and small valuables arranged with the speed of people who had been planning this and were now executing it faster than intended. On the dresser, a stack of passports and an envelope of what looked like cash sat beside a laptop bag that was zipped and ready. Marcus was at the closet pulling dress shirts off hangers in fistfuls, not folding them, just compressing them into the suitcase with both hands. Linda was at the safe mounted in the wall beside the bathroom door, her back to the room, working the combination with the focused efficiency of someone who knew the numbers by heart. Chloe stood 4 feet inside the room. She had stopped moving when they noticed her, and they had stopped moving when they noticed her, and the three of them were arranged in the kind of frozen tableau that happens in the half-second before everything changes. Chloe's face was the color of the winter sky outside, all the blood gone out of it, her hands hanging at her sides with the fingers slightly open. She was looking at Linda, not at Marcus, at Linda. I understood that. The betrayal that could be explained, the one you could eventually build a story around and move past, was the husband. The one that went deeper and left a different kind of mark was the woman who had sat across from her at holidays and called her sweetheart and asked about her work, and all the while had been carrying this. Marcus heard her first. He turned from the closet and saw Chloe standing in the doorway, and whatever he had been about to do with the dress shirts in his hands, he stopped doing it. His face went through several things in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and then something that might have been the beginning of shame if he had gotten far enough to reach it. He took one step toward her with his hands coming up in a gesture that was halfway between reaching out and explaining himself. Chloe. His voice was different from every version of it I had heard in 6 years. Smaller. Listen to me. This is not what it looks like. Don't! Her voice came out of her with a precision that was worse than anger. Don't say another word to me right now. Not one. He stopped. His hands came down. Linda had turned from the safe when she heard Chloe's voice. She was holding a small velvet pouch, the kind that holds jewelry, and she was looking at me now, not at Chloe, because she understood immediately and completely what my presence in that doorway meant in a way that Marcus had not yet caught up with. The expression on her face was one I had never seen in 4 years of marriage. No performance. No management. Just a woman standing in the full wreckage of what she had built, knowing it was over and not yet having decided what to do with that knowledge. Arthur, she said. My name in her mouth sounded different than it ever had. Smaller. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at Marcus, who was exactly what I had known him to be for 14 months, the man standing in my son-in-law's place, who had been meeting my wife in a hotel on the west side of Columbus, while my daughter believed her marriage was worth saving. 2 people who had found in each other not just an affair, but a plan, and had been quietly executing that plan while everyone around them looked the other way. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at the suitcases on the bed, and the passports on the dresser, and the laptop bag by the door. And I thought about Gerald Foss's report, and the 14 months of Thursday evenings, and the joint account transfers, and the toxicology results that I had not yet mentioned to anyone except Thomas. The safe, Linda, I said. Put back whatever you just took out of it. Her chin came up. Old habit. You have no right to. The warrant was issued in connection with a federal tax investigation under Title 26 of the United States Code, supported by probable cause documented in Gerald's report. The word warrant landed in the room like a change in air pressure. Marcus's hands came down slowly. He looked at me with an expression that had moved past calculation into something rawer and less managed. Linda's grip on the velvet pouch tightened for a moment, and then slowly released. She turned back to the safe and placed the pouch inside with the careful movements of someone performing an action they despise being forced to perform. Chloe had not moved. She was looking at the passports on the dresser. There were 3 of them. I watched her count them, and watched her understand what 3 passports meant, which was that this departure had been planned for 2 people, not 1. Where were you going? Her voice was very quiet. Marcus did not answer. Marcus. She turned to look at him, and her face had passed through shock and was arriving at something colder and more durable. Where were you going? He looked at the floor. His jaw worked. Chloe, if you'll just let me explain. Nassau, Linda said. We all looked at her. She was standing with her back to the safe, her arms at her sides, and she said it the way a person says the one true thing they have left flatly and without decoration. Nassau. We had tickets for tomorrow morning. Columbus to Miami, Miami to Nassau. We had an account there, separate from everything here. The room was very quiet after that. Chloe turned away from both of them and walked toward me, and when she reached the doorway, she stopped, and I put my arm around her shoulders and felt the trembling that was running through her whole body, the kind of trembling that comes not from cold, but from the effort of holding yourself upright when everything you believed has just been rearranged. I've got you, I said. She pressed her face against my shoulder for just a moment, one breath too. Then she straightened. From downstairs came the sound of the front door opening. Then Thomas's voice in the entrance hall, calm and carrying, talking to someone in the clipped professional shorthand he used with law enforcement. Then footsteps on the stairs, more than 2 sets. Marcus looked toward the hallway, then at me. His voice had gone flat. You planned all of this. I looked at my son-in-law standing in the wreckage of his own choices, surrounded by the evidence of what he had decided to do with the trust of a woman who had loved him, and I felt no satisfaction. Only the particular exhaustion of a thing that has been a long time coming and has finally arrived. No, I said. You planned this. I just made sure someone was paying attention. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind me with 2 federal agents. He looked at the room with the expression of a man who has reviewed enough documentation to have expected exactly this and is neither surprised nor pleased to be right. Mr. Whitmore, he said. Thomas. He stepped past me into the room, and the agents came in behind him, and the business of consequences began. We moved downstairs 20 minutes after the agents arrived. Thomas had taken over the dining room in the efficient, unhurried way he took over every room he worked, in which was to say he had placed his briefcase on the table, opened it, and arranged its contents with the precision of a man who understood that order was not a preference, but a professional obligation. 2 federal agents were conducting a methodical sweep of the upstairs rooms. A third had stationed himself near the front door. Marcus sat in an armchair in the corner with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the floor, saying nothing to anyone. Linda sat across the room on the settee, with her hands in her lap, her posture still correct, still carrying the last remnants of a composure she no longer had any use for. Chloe sat beside me on the small sofa near the window. She had stopped trembling. What had replaced the trembling was a stillness that was not calm, but its surface the kind of quiet that comes after the loudest thing has already happened. Thomas opened the first folder. I'll be brief, he said, addressing the room without addressing anyone specifically, the way he spoke when he wanted the information to land, without interference from personalities. The documentation compiled by Gerald Foss over the past 3 months has been reviewed by 2 independent forensic accountants retained by Blackwood Capital and submitted to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Ohio. He turned a page. The Whitfield family's corporate entities show a pattern of fraudulent expense reporting and income concealment spanning 7 fiscal years. Thomas set that folder aside and opened a second one, thinner. He placed it on the table and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. There is a secondary matter, he said, separate from the tax investigation. He reached into the briefcase and removed a small evidence bag. Inside it was a sealed laboratory report. He set it on the table and did not touch it again. Over a period of approximately 8 months, a controlled substance identified as lorazepam was introduced into Mr. Whitmore's food and beverages on a recurring basis. Lorazepam is a benzodiazepine commonly prescribed for anxiety and sleep disorders. When administered without a prescription to another person, without their knowledge or consent, it constitutes a felony under Ohio Revised Code Section 290, 3.11 felonious assault, as well as Section 2925.002, corrupting another with drugs. Both carry potential sentences of 2 to 8 years under Ohio law. He paused and opened a third folder. There is also the matter of the relationship between Mrs. Linda Whitmore and Mr. Marcus Whitfield. Gerald Foss's investigation documented a personal relationship between the two that began at least 14 months ago and continued through the date of Mrs. Whitmore's arrest. In addition to the personal dimension, Gerald's financial analysis identified a pattern of parallel transfers. Mrs. Whitmore was moving funds from her joint account with Mr. Arthur Whitmore. Mr. Whitfield was moving funds from 3 accounts concealed from his wife. Both transfer streams were directed to a single offshore account registered in Nassau, Bahamas, opened 14 months ago under a shell entity registered to neither of their names. Thomas turned a page. The account currently holds assets totaling approximately $840,000. The departure they were preparing was not impulsive. It had been planned for over a year. The room absorbed that in complete silence. I looked at Linda. She was looking at the evidence bag on the table. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were dry, and she had the expression of a person who is performing the act of feeling nothing, because feeling nothing is the last form of control available to them. The samples were collected by Gerald Foss from Mr. Whitmore's residence over a 6-week period. Thomas continued. Using standard chain of custody procedures admissible in Ohio State Court. Laboratory analysis was conducted by an independent toxicology firm in Cincinnati. The results are unambiguous. One of the federal agents crossed the room and stood near Linda, not touching her, just present. The way agents stand when they are waiting for a signal. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed an envelope. Not the brown one. A white one, smaller, with Thomas's firm name in the upper left corner and Linda's full legal name typed across the front. I stood up and walked across the room and set it on the settee cushion beside her. She looked at it, then at me. Divorce papers, I said. Fault-based under Ohio law. The filing cites fraudulent concealment of assets and criminal conduct during the marriage. Your attorney will explain what that means for the division of property. I paused. There won't be much to divide. Linda looked at the envelope for a long moment. Her throat moved. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than I had ever heard it, stripped of every layer she had built on top of the original thing. How long did you know? Long enough. And you never said anything. I needed the complete picture, I said. Same as I told Chloe this morning. Something crossed her face then that I had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with. Not remorse exactly. Something older and more complicated than remorse, the expression of a person who has just understood too late and too completely the nature of what they threw away. She reached out and picked up the envelope. The agent beside her stepped forward then and spoke the words that agents speak in that moment, clear and procedural, the rights she was entitled to under the 5th and 6th Amendments of the United States Constitution, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the right to have one appointed if she could not afford one. Linda listened with her eyes on the envelope in her hands, and when the agent finished, she nodded once. She stood. She straightened her jacket with one hand, a small automatic gesture muscle memory from 1,000 rooms where appearance had mattered. Then she walked toward the front door between the agent and the wall without looking back at anyone. I watched her go. Chloe had come to stand beside me at some point during the last few minutes. I felt her hand find mine the same way she had reached for my hand when she was small, and the world had presented her with something larger than she knew how to hold. I held on. Across the room, Marcus raised his head and looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had worn something like it myself once a long time ago, standing in a different room with the evidence of my own failures laid out in front of me. It was the expression of a man who has finally run out of the distance between himself and the truth. "What happens now?" he asked. Thomas closed his briefcase with a soft, precise click. "Now," he said, "the law takes over." We did not speak for the first 20 minutes. I drove, and Chloe sat with her hands in her lap, and the December farmland moved past the windows in the flat gray way it had on the drive out, indifferent to what had happened since we had last seen it. That indifference felt almost kind. The fields did not know what Chloe had walked into that morning. The bare trees along the highway did not know what she had seen on the second floor of a house she had believed was partly hers. The world outside the truck windows was simply continuing, which was its habit, and there was something steadying about that, even if it did not feel that way yet. I had turned the heat up on the drive, and the cab was warm. Chloe had her coat still on, which told me she had not yet settled back into her body completely, the way people keep their outer layers on, when part of them is still somewhere else. She spoke first. "Dad." Her voice was quiet, and even the voice she used when she had been thinking about something long enough to have organized it. "Who are you, I mean, really? Not the wood shop, not the truck. Who are you actually?" I kept my eyes on this road for a moment. A semi passed us on the left, and the truck rocked gently in the wash of it and steadied again. "I was a structural engineer," I said. "Before you were born and for several years after. I worked on commercial construction projects across Ohio and Indiana and Michigan. Bridges, loading facilities, municipal infrastructure. I was good at it, and the timing was right, and I made more money than I knew how to spend carefully." I paused. "So I learned how to spend it carefully." She turned toward me on the seat. "Blackwood Capital." "Yes." "How much?" I considered the question, the way I always considered questions about numbers, which was to ask myself whether the number itself was the point, or whether it was just the easiest version of a harder question. "Enough that Senator Whitfield's dinner table manners should have been considerably better," I said. A short sound came out of her. Not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood of one. The first sound like that I had heard from her all day, and it loosened something in my chest that had been tight since 3 o'clock that morning. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jay asked. "Not about Linda. About you. About all of it." This was the question I had been preparing for and dreading in equal measure for 11 years. I took a breath and told her about her mother. I told her about the back porch in August, and the fireflies, and the mug of tea Ruth had held without drinking, and the particular quality of her voice in those last weeks, thin but precise, every word chosen, with the care of someone who knows they have a limited number left. I told her what Ruth had said about money and love, and the difference between being chosen for who you are and being chosen for what surrounds you. I told her that I had believed her mother was right because Ruth was almost always right, and that I had built the disguise with the best intentions and held on to it past the point where intentions were sufficient justification. Chloe listened without interrupting. Outside, the highway signs for Gahanna began to appear. "She said that," Chloe asked when I finished. "Word for word, word for word. I've heard it in my head every day since." She looked out the windshield for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed the evenness in it, giving way to something softer and less managed. "She was right," Chloe said. "About the money. I think if I had known I would have... She stopped. I don't know what I would have done differently, but I think I would have been different. More careful, maybe. Or more afraid. She pressed her lips together. Marcus would have known from the beginning. He would have shown me a different version of himself. Yes, I said. I believe he would have. So she protected me. She tried to. I tried to carry it forward. I glanced at her. I held on to it too long. That part was my failure, not hers. She shook her head slowly. You were trying to do what she asked. I was. And then I was using what she asked as a reason not to have a harder conversation with you. Those are different things, and I let myself pretend they were the same. She did not argue with that which was its own form of grace. We took the Gehenna exit, and the familiar streets of the neighborhood came up around us, the same houses and corner stores and bare-limbed trees we had driven past 10,000 times. I married the wrong man, Chloe said. Not with bitterness, with the clean, factual tone of someone naming a thing accurately for the first time. Yes, because I didn't have enough information, partly. Also because you loved him. Those two things can both be true. She thought about that. We turned onto our street and I slowed for the driveway and pulled in and cut the engine. Neither of us moved immediately. The tick of the cooling engine filled the cab. Dad! She looked at me in the dim interior of the truck, her mother's eyes finding mine, in the way Ruth's always had, directly and without flinching. I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that. I'm going to need some time with all of this, but I am not angry at you. My throat tightened in a way I had not expected and did not entirely manage. Thank you, I said. It came out rougher than I intended. She reached over and put her hand over mine on the steering wheel, the same gesture her mother had used 1,000 times on 1,000 ordinary evenings, and held it there for a moment. Then she got out of the truck and went inside, and I sat alone in the dark cab for a while, with my hand on the steering wheel and the cooling engine ticking, and the particular silence of a man who has finally said the true thing and found that the world did not end. It was the best silence I had sat in for 11 years. I was in the woodshop by 6, not because there was anything urgent to build, but because the shop was the place I went when I needed my hands to be busy, while the rest of me caught up with recent events. I had slept 4 hours, which was more than I expected, and woke before the alarm with the particular clarity that sometimes follows a night when something long held has finally been released. The cold hit me crossing the yard sharp and clean, and I was grateful for it. I had been working on a set of cabinet doors for a neighbor down the street, a retired schoolteacher named Carol, who had been waiting on them patiently for 6 weeks and deserved better than 6 weeks. I ran the first door through the sander and let the rhythm of it settle me, and thought about what Thomas had sent at midnight. The message covered 3 items. Senator Whitfield's primary legal team had contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office to begin preliminary discussions, which in federal tax matters was the first step toward a cooperation agreement. 2 of the senator's largest development partners had already suspended their contracts with the Whitfield companies pending resolution of the audit. And Linda had been released on bail late the previous evening, the bail set at $50,000, with a condition that she surrender her passport and remain within Franklin County. I read it once and put the phone away. The law was doing what Thomas had said it would do. Chloe appeared at the shop door at 8:30 with 2 mugs of coffee, which meant she had been up for a while and had decided that coming to find me was better than sitting alone in the kitchen with her thoughts. I turned off the sander and took the mug she offered, and we stood together in the shop doorway, looking out at the backyard, the dormant grass white with frost, the bird feeder doing its usual morning business. "How are you doing?" I asked. She thought about it honestly, which I appreciated more than a quick answer. "I keep starting to think about something and then stopping myself. Like I know the thought is there, but I'm not ready to look at it directly yet. That's reasonable. Is it? She wrapped both hands around her mug. It feels like avoiding. There's a difference between avoiding and pacing yourself, I said. One of them is fear. The other is just good sense. She considered that. A cardinal landed on the feeder, the same one exactly like it, bright red against the gray morning, and worked at the seeds with focused industry. I want to see the shop, she said. The real one. Not just this garage. I mean Blackwood. I mean all of it. She looked at me. I want to understand what you actually built. Something shifted in my chest at that, a loosening I had not known was still tight. We can do that. Not today. No, when you're ready. She nodded and drank her coffee, and we stood together in a quiet that was entirely different from the quiet of the previous weeks, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with what had been resolved and everything to do with what had finally been said. Thomas called at 9:15 with one addition to his midnight report. Senator Whitfield himself had placed a call to Thomas's office that morning, requesting a conversation with Arthur directly. I told Thomas to tell him I would think about it, and ended the call before Thomas could offer an opinion either way. Chloe looked at me over her mug. The senator, he wants to talk. What are you going to do? Think about it. I set my mug on the workbench. He's not my primary concern right now. She accepted that without pushing, which was something she had always been good at, knowing which questions to ask and which ones to let sit. We went inside around 10, and I made eggs and she made toast, and we ate at the kitchen table the way we had eaten 1,000 mornings before everything changed, except that this morning, the silence between sentences was comfortable rather than careful, and that difference was everything. I was washing the dishes when I heard a car in the driveway. I dried my hands and looked through the kitchen window. A silver sedan I did not recognize had pulled in behind my truck. The driver's door opened, and Eleanor Whitfield stepped out. She was alone. No driver, no companion, no security. She was wearing a plain gray coat I had never seen before, and flat shoes, and her hair was not styled the way it always was at family gatherings, but pulled back simply, almost severely. She stood beside her car for a moment, looking at the house with an expression I could not read from the window, and then she began walking toward the front door. Chloe appeared beside me at the window. Her shoulder pressed against mine, and I felt her go still. She came alone, Chloe said quietly. Yes. A long pause. Outside, Eleanor's footsteps crossed the front walk. Dad. Chloe's voice was careful but steady. What do you want to do? I watched Eleanor Whitfield stop at the front door. She did not ring the bell immediately. She stood with her hand raised and her eyes on the door, and the expression on her face was one I had never seen her wear in 6 years of knowing her. It was uncertainty. Let's hear what she has to say, I said. I opened the door before she knocked. She startled slightly, which told me she had been standing there longer than a few seconds, working herself up to the bell. Up close, she looked older than she had at Thanksgiving, not in the way people look older when time has passed, but in the way they look older when something has been taken out of them. The careful architecture of her usual presentation was gone. No diamond earrings. No burgundy wrap dress. Just a gray coat over a plain blouse and the face of a 63-year-old woman who had not slept. Arthur, she said. Eleanor. I stepped back from the door. Come in. She hesitated for just a moment, the hesitation of someone who had rehearsed an arrival and was finding that the real version moved differently than the practiced one. Then she crossed the threshold, and I closed the door behind her. Chloe was standing in the entrance to the kitchen. She had her coffee mug in both hands, and she watched Eleanor come in with an expression that was carefully neutral, not warm and not hostile, the expression of someone who has decided to wait and see before deciding anything else. I was proud of her for that. It was harder than it looked. Eleanor saw Chloe and stopped walking. The two women looked at each other across the entrance hall, and nobody spoke for a moment. That was long enough to have weight, but not so long as to become impossible. I watched Eleanor's throat move. "Chloe," she said. Her voice was different from every version of it I had heard before, stripped of its dinner party projection. Just a woman's voice in a quiet hallway. "I owe you something I should have given you a long time ago." Chloe waited. "An apology," Eleanor said. "A real one. Not the kind that explains itself into a justification." She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor for a moment, and then back up. "What I did at Thanksgiving was unforgivable. I know that. I'm not here because I think an apology fixes it. I'm here because I couldn't live with having never said it directly to your face." Chloe did not move. Her grip on the mug tightened slightly. "Why did you do it?" Eleanor absorbed the question without flinching, which surprised me. "Because I was frightened," she said. "And because I had spent so many years confusing cruelty with control that I stopped being able to tell them apart." She paused. "That is not an excuse. It is the only honest answer I have." I gestured toward the living room. "Sit down, Eleanor." We settled into the room, Eleanor on the chair nearest the window, Chloe on the sofa, me standing near the doorway, because sitting felt premature. Eleanor kept her coat on. Another small signal, the posture of a person who is not assuming they will be staying long and does not want to presume. "My husband is cooperating with the federal investigators," Eleanor said, addressing me now. "His attorneys have advised full disclosure in exchange for a reduced sentencing recommendation. The company will be restructured under court supervision." She looked at her hands. "We will lose most of it. The house, the development portfolio, most of the investments." A short pause. "I find that I mind it considerably less than I expected to." "What do you mind?" I asked. She looked up at me. "Marcus," she said simply. "What Marcus became, what I allowed him to become by never requiring anything better of him." Her voice thinned on the last sentence. "He learned it somewhere. Children always do." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the cardinal was back on the bird feeder, that small, reliable point of color in the gray yard. "Mrs. Whitfield." I walked to the center of the room and stood where she could see me clearly. "You said something at your dinner table on Thanksgiving night. Do you remember what you said?" Her jaw tightened. "Yes." "Say it back to me." A flicker of the old resistance crossed her face. Then it passed, and what replaced it was something rawer and more honest. She straightened in the chair and met my eyes and repeated the words she had said haltingly and without the venom that had powered them the first time. Just the words themselves, standing in the quiet warmth of my living room, stripped of the grand dining hall acoustics, where they sounded exactly like what they were. When she finished, the room was very still. "You said the smell of my woodshop dirtied your carpet," I said. "You said my daughter was a stain on your family name." I let that sit for a moment. "The building your husband's flagship development company has operated from for the past 9 years was financed through Blackwood Capital. I reviewed the structural engineering drawings before the ground broke. I know every load-bearing wall in that building." I paused. "The smell you were describing paid for the address on your husband's business card." Eleanor did not look away. Her eyes were bright, and her hands were gripping each other in her lap, and she did not say a single word, which was the most honest response available to her, and she seemed to know it. Chloe set her coffee mug down on the side table. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and looked at Eleanor with her mother's direct, unhurried gaze. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Chloe said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't know if I ever will be, and I'm not going to tell you something that isn't true." Eleanor nodded once. Her eyes had filled, but she was not going to let the tears fall in this room, and I found I respected that. "But I heard what you said," Chloe continued, "about Marcus, about what children learn." She paused. "I think you mean it. I think you actually mean it this time." Eleanor's chin dropped toward her chest. Her shoulders moved once, a single compressed motion, the body doing what the face was refusing to do. When she raised her head again, her expression had broken open in a way that changed it completely. All the architecture of performance finally gone. Just a woman in a gray coat, sitting in a living room. She had no right to be comfortable in trying to be honest for possibly the first time in years. "I do," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I mean every word of it." Nobody rushed to fill the silence that followed. Some silences are not empty. Some of them are the sound of people deciding one breath at a time what they are willing to carry forward and what they are finally willing to put down. The silence lasted long enough that I began to think no one was going to break it. Then Chloe stood up. She did not look at me first, which I noticed and was glad of. What she was about to do, she needed to do on her own terms, without checking my face for permission or reassurance or any signal at all. She had spent enough years looking at other people's faces to gauge whether it was safe to speak. That was over now. She set her coffee mug on the side table with the careful deliberateness of someone who is organizing the small things around them because they are about to say something large. Then she walked to the center of the room and stood between me and Eleanor, equidistant, not choosing a side, and looked at the older woman with her mother's eyes. Eleanor straightened in her chair. "I want to say some things," Chloe said. "I'm not going to yell and I'm not going to fall apart. I just need you to hear them." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "I'm listening." "You hit me in front of 40 people. Chloe's voice was level and clear, the voice of someone who has rehearsed nothing and is simply telling the truth from the beginning. "You called me trailer trash. You said I had no education. You told me I had dirtied your carpet just by standing in your house." She paused. "I have a master's degree in urban planning from Ohio State. I have worked for the same nonprofit housing organization for 4 years. I have never once asked your family for anything." Another pause, shorter. "I want you to know those things. Not because they make the slap hurt less. Because you said them as if they were true and they were not." Eleanor's hands tightened against each other, but she did not interrupt. "I grew up in a wood shop," Chloe continued. "I know how to read a set of construction drawings. I know how to run a table saw and a jointer and a router. I know how to build something from raw material and have it come out square and true." Her voice was steady, but there was heat underneath it, now controlled heat, the kind that comes from something that has been compressed for a long time and is finally being allowed to move. "You looked at where I came from and decided it told you everything you needed to know about who I was. You were wrong, and the fact that you were wrong cost me 4 years of my life and a marriage that never had a real foundation because the man I married learned from watching you that the people around him existed to serve his comfort." Eleanor's eyes had filled completely now. One tear made it down her cheek before she caught the rest of them. "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "I know that." "I'm not finished." Chloe said it without sharpness, just a statement of fact. Eleanor closed her mouth. "My mother died when I was 15 years old," Chloe said. "My father raised me alone in a house that always smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, and I had everything I needed. I had a person who showed up every single day without fail, who never once made me feel like a burden, who built me a bookshelf for my 16th birthday because I had run out of room for my books, and he noticed. Her voice shifted on the last sentence, the heat giving way to something quieter and more permanent. That is what a family looks like. Not the house, not the address, not the crystal glasses and the donor wall at the art museum. The person who notices. The room was completely still. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, its engine a distant murmur that faded and was gone. I had moved without realizing it to the doorway between the living room and the entrance hall. I stood there with my shoulder against the doorframe and my arms at my sides, and I let my daughter finish what she had come to say. "I don't know what happens between us from here," Chloe said to Eleanor. "I meant what I said. I'm not going to tell you I forgive you when I don't know yet if I do. But I needed you to hear those things from me directly. Not through a lawyer. Not through my father." She glanced at me briefly 1 second, and then back to Eleanor. "From me." Eleanor unclenched her hands in her lap. She pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed in through her nose and out slowly, the breathing of someone working very hard to stay present in a moment that was asking a great deal of them. "You deserved better," Eleanor said. Her voice was rough at the edges. "From my son. From me. From the first day you walked into my house." She looked at Chloe directly. No performance in it, nothing managed or curated. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I would in your position. But I want you to know that I heard everything you just said. Every word." She paused. "And I will not forget it." Chloe studied her for a moment, with the measuring look her mother had used when she was deciding whether something was true. Then she gave one small nod, the kind that does not mean forgiveness and does not mean its opposite, but means simply, "I have said what I came to say, and I believe you heard it." She walked back to the sofa and sat down and picked up her coffee mug and held it with both hands. I looked at Eleanor. She was looking at Chloe with an expression that was going to take her a long time to work through on her own, and that was exactly as it should be. "Eleanor," I said, "can I get you some coffee?" She blinked. The question was so ordinary against everything that had just been said that it seemed to take her a moment to process it. Then something in her face shifted, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the loosening of muscles that have been held tight for too long. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Arthur. I think I would like that." I had not worn a suit in 4 years. The one I chose that morning was charcoal gray Italian wool bought in 2019 for a closing dinner on a municipal bond transaction that Thomas had insisted required something better than flannel. It still fit, which said something about the difference between the life I presented and the life I actually lived. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment, before putting on the jacket, and looked at the man looking back at me and tried to decide whether he looked unfamiliar or simply unaccustomed. Chloe was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She had her back to me pouring coffee, and when she turned and saw me, she stopped with the pot in her hand and looked at me the way you look at something that is simultaneously new and exactly what you expected. "You look different," she said. "I am different. This morning." She set the pot down and studied me with her head tilted slightly. "Is this what you wore? Before? When you were doing this the other way?" "Something like it." She handed me a travel mug without being asked. "Come home for dinner." "I will." The drive to Thomas's office in downtown Columbus took 22 minutes in light morning traffic. I parked in the garage on High Street that Blackwood's account had maintained a reserved space in for 11 years, a space I had used perhaps a dozen times, in all that while always arriving early and leaving before the building filled. This morning I arrived at 8:45 and took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked through the glass doors of Webb Calloway and Associates with my name on the visitor log for the first time in the history of my relationship with the firm. Thomas met me at the reception desk. He looked at me the way he always looked at me, which was to say, he took in the relevant information and processed it without comment. But there was something in the set of his expression that I had not seen there before. Something that, in a less reserved man, might have been called satisfaction. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." "Thomas." I shook his hand. "Let's get to work." The conference room was prepared with the thoroughness I had come to expect from Thomas over 11 years, which was to say, it was prepared with a thoroughness that left nothing to chance and nothing to explanation. 2 binders sat at the head of the table. A credenza along the wall held a summary of Blackwood's current holdings printed and organized by asset class. Beside it, a separate folder marked with a tab that read, "Whitfield Resolution," contained everything relevant to the current legal proceedings. Thomas took me through it methodically. The Senator's cooperation agreement had been formally executed 2 days earlier. Under its terms, Senator Harold Whitfield and his primary corporate entities would plead guilty to 4 counts of tax fraud under Title 26 of the United States Code. The total restitution amount had been negotiated at $3.9 million to be paid over 5 years from the liquidation of identified assets. In exchange, the U.S. Attorney's Office had agreed to recommend a sentence of 36 months, with eligibility for early release after 18 to be served at a minimum security federal facility. The Senator's attorneys had described this outcome to their client as favorable. Thomas described it to me with the neutrality of a man who had reviewed the documentation and formed no opinion he was prepared to share. The Blackwood position, Thomas continued, opening the second binder, requires several decisions from you directly. The credit facilities extended to the Whitfield development portfolio will be wound down over the next 90 days as the assets are liquidated under court supervision. The question is what Blackwood does with the capital once it's returned. "Reinvest," I said. "Same sector, different partners." Thomas made a note. "There is also the matter of the Short North project, the one Senator Whitfield was describing at dinner." He turned a page. "The underlying real estate has value independent of the Whitfield involvement. 3 other development groups have already made preliminary inquiries since the news broke." "Who's the strongest?" "A group out of Cleveland. Good track record, clean financials, community development focus." Thomas paused. "They have a housing affordability component built into their proposal." I thought about Chloe standing in the Whitfield dining room saying that working families in that neighborhood deserved to stay in their homes. I thought about how quietly she had said it and how quickly Eleanor had used it against her. "Set up a meeting," I said. Thomas made another note. We worked through the rest of the Blackwood matters for the better part of an hour, the kinds of decisions that accumulate when a portfolio of that size goes untended for several weeks. I had relied on Thomas's management authority during that time, and he had exercised it conservatively and well, as he always did. At the end of the hour, I sat back in my chair and looked at the credenza and the binders and the summary of a thing I had built over 20 years, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in this room. Tired of hiding it, not ashamed of it, not uncertain about it. Simply tired of the weight of keeping it invisible, of the ongoing effort of performing a version of myself that was accurate in spirit but incomplete in fact. I had done it for Ruth, and I had done it for Chloe, and those were good reasons that had served their purpose and run their course. "Thomas," I said, "I want to talk about the anonymity structure." He set his pen down. "I thought you might. It served its purpose. Chloe knows. The people who needed not to know for the right reasons have been identified." I paused. "I don't intend to make Blackwood public in any splashy way. No press releases, no profile in the business journal. But I want to stop pretending the connection doesn't exist." Thomas considered this with the careful precision he brought to every consequential question. There are some administrative steps involved. The Delaware registration can be amended. The intermediary structures can be simplified. He paused. It will take about 30 days. Start whenever you're ready. He nodded once. Then he said, "There's one more item." He reached into the second binder and removed a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table toward me. Senator Whitfield submitted this request through his attorneys 3 days ago. I held it until today because I wanted you to have the context of the full resolution before you saw it. I picked it up. It was a formal letter on the senator's personal letterhead, not his corporate stationery. The language was precise in the way that language is precise when an attorney has reviewed it, but the person writing it meant what it said. The senator was not asking for leniency in the legal proceedings. He was not asking for Blackwood to modify its position in the wind down. He was asking for a meeting, just the two of them at a time and place of my choosing, with no lawyers present. At the bottom below his signature, he had added 2 handwritten sentences in the cramped, careful script of a man who does not often write by hand. I owe your daughter an apology that I am not equipped to give her yet, but I owe you one that I am ready to give now. I read it twice. Then I folded it along its original creases and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, against my chest, where my father used to keep letters he was still thinking about. "Tell his attorneys I'll be in touch," I said. Thomas nodded and we gathered the binders and I stood up and put on my jacket, and we walked out of the conference room together into the corridor. On the way to the elevator, I passed the lobby mirror, the large one opposite the reception desk that reflected the full length of the room, and I saw myself coming toward me in the charcoal suit with the travel mug Chloe had handed me still in my hand. I looked like someone who was done pretending to be smaller than he was. Not larger, not something to be impressed by. Just the actual size, the real dimensions of a person who had built something over a long life and was finally willing to stand next to it without apologizing for its existence. I pressed the elevator button and waited. Behind me, through those glass doors, Thomas was already back at his desk. 11 years of careful, quiet work, most of it unacknowledged, all of it done because it was what the situation required. I made a mental note to tell him at some point soon, in whatever words seemed right, that I knew what it had cost him and that I was grateful for it. The elevator opened. I stepped in. On the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus, in the offices of a law firm that had spent 11 years protecting a name nobody knew. The morning continued in its ordinary way. Phones rang. Printers ran. People moved from room to room with coffee and files and the regular business of a working day. Somewhere in the structure of that building, in the walls and the floors and the load-bearing columns that held everything up, was the work of a man who had once been called a structural engineer and had never entirely stopped being one. I rode the elevator down and went home to my daughter. We moved the last of it on a Thursday. 2 truckloads, my Ford and a rented panel van that Chloe drove herself, both of them packed with the tools and materials and accumulated equipment of a woodshop that had occupied the back half of my Gahanna garage for 23 years. The new property was 40 minutes east of Columbus, outside a small town called Granville, a place where the roads narrowed and the trees grew close to the shoulders, and the air, on cold mornings, had a quality to it that the suburbs had lost somewhere along the way. The main building had been a working barn once and still carried the structural logic of that original purpose. Heavy timber framing thick plank walls, a loft space above the main floor that caught the morning light through a bank of east-facing windows. I had bought it in October, 2 months before any of the rest of it happened, on an afternoon, when I had driven out of Columbus without a particular destination and found myself on a county road outside Granville looking at a for sale sign on a property that seemed to be waiting for something specific to do with itself. The bones of it were good. The rest was work. Chloe had seen it for the first time the week after Eleanor's visit, when I drove her out one afternoon and showed her the building and the property and the view from the east side where a creek ran along the tree line with the particular purposeful sound of water that knows exactly where it is going. She had walked through the empty barn without saying much, running her hand along the timber framing, looking up at the loft windows, crouching down to check the condition of the plank floor. When we got back in the truck, she sat for a moment and looked out the windshield at the building. "This is where you were always going," she said. I started the engine. "Eventually. You bought it before everything happened." "I bought it before you knew everything had happened." She thought about that for a moment. "So you already knew we were going to need somewhere new to go." "I knew I was going to need it," I said. "I hoped you might want to come." She looked at me with her mother's eyes. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought it was your decision to make, not mine." She had nodded once and looked back at the building, and something in her face had settled into a resolution that I recognized because I had seen its predecessor in Ruth's face 30 years earlier, the expression of a person who has found the place where the next chapter of their life is going to happen and has decided they are ready to begin it. On moving day, the temperature was 28 degrees, and the sky had the high white quality of a December day in central Ohio that might produce snow before evening. We worked through the morning without rushing, carrying tools and wrapping equipment, and loading the van with the systematic patience of people who know that the only way to move a woodshop properly is one careful piece at a time. Chloe wrapped the hand planes in shop rags, the way I had always wrapped them. She had learned it without being formally taught, simply by watching across years of mornings in the Gehenna garage. And I did not comment on it because some things are better received without attention drawn to them. By early afternoon, everything was loaded. I stood in the empty space of the old shop for a moment before I closed it for the last time. The workbench was still there, too heavy to move, built into the wall 20 years ago, with lag bolts and intention. I had built Chloe's first bookshelf on that bench, the one she had mentioned to Eleanor. A set of shelves for a 16-year-old who had run out of room for her books. Nothing complicated, pine and wood glue, and a Saturday afternoon. But she had kept it in every apartment and house she had lived in since, and it was in the van now, wrapped in moving blankets. I turned off the light and closed the door, and drove east toward Granville. We spent the rest of the day unpacking and arranging, and making the decisions that a new space requires, where the table saw goes, how the lumber storage should be organized, whether the hand tool cabinet belongs on the east wall or the north. Chloe had opinions about all of it, and most of her opinions were right, which I told her, and she accepted the acknowledgement with the practiced ease of someone who is learning to take a compliment without deflecting it. By 4 in the afternoon, the shop had the beginning of an order to it. Not finished, not settled, but oriented, pointing in the right direction. I had a piece of walnut I had been saving for 2 years, a board 30 inches wide and 6 feet long, straight-grained and clean, the kind of piece that comes through a woodshop once a decade and asks you to be careful with it. I brought it in from the van last and set it on the new workbench and looked at it in the east window light. Chloe came to stand beside me. "What's that for?" "I don't know yet," I said. "But I've been keeping it until I did." She looked at the board for a moment. "Maybe you'll know now." I thought she was probably right. We met Senator Whitfield the following Tuesday. He came alone as he had promised to a coffee shop on the square in Granville that had been there since before either of us was born, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and handwritten daily specials and coffee that was better than it needed to be. He arrived before us, which I had not expected, and was sitting in a corner booth with his hands wrapped around a mug when Chloe and I came in from the cold. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, the man still took up the same space he always had. But the particular expansiveness that wealth and position generate around a person, the invisible architecture of importance, was gone. What was left was a man in his late 60s who had done serious damage to his family and was beginning the long work of understanding the full dimensions of it. He stood when he saw us. "Arthur." He extended his hand, and I shook it. Then he turned to Chloe, and his expression changed in a way that had nothing performed about it. A genuine contraction of the face that comes when a person is looking directly at the evidence of something they did. "Chloe, thank you for coming." She shook his hand. "Senator." He had asked to speak, so I let him speak. He talked for 20 minutes without interruption. He talked about the dinner and his own silence during it, which he described without excuses as a failure of character that had compounded a failure of character he had been practicing for years. He talked about Marcus and what he now understood about the environment that had produced him, the way wealth without accountability had replaced accountability with something that looked like it from a distance and was nothing like it up close. He talked about Eleanor and the long project of understanding a marriage more clearly than he had wanted to. He talked about the plea agreement in the terms a man uses when he has accepted the consequence of something and is no longer trying to manage the narrative around it. Then he stopped and looked at Chloe. "I owe you an apology that is not going to be adequate," he said. "I know that. I sat at the head of my own dinner table and watched my wife strike you, and I said nothing. I had the authority to stop it years before that night, and I used that authority for other things." He put both hands flat on the table between them. "I am sorry. Not for the legal consequences or the business. For what we did to you. For what we allowed you to believe about yourself by treating you the way we did." Chloe looked at him for a long moment, with the steady measuring gaze she had been using since childhood to determine whether something was true. "I hear you," she said. "Not I forgive you. Not it's all right. Just the clear, honest statement of a woman who was no longer in the business of offering comfort she did not feel. I hear you, and I believe you mean it." The senator nodded. He looked like a man who had expected less and was grateful for exactly what he had received. We drank our coffee and talked for another half-hour about nothing of consequence. The town, the weather, a renovation project in Granville's historic district that had apparently been ongoing for 3 years. It was the conversation of people who are not yet comfortable but are committed to being decent to one another, which is a smaller thing than reconciliation, and sometimes the more honest one. Outside in the parking lot afterward, Chloe slipped her hand into the crook of my arm the way she had when she was small, and we walked back to the truck together in the cold. "Are you all right?" I asked. She thought about it. "I think I will be." She glanced up at me. "That's different from saying I'm fine. I'm not fine yet. But I think I will be." "That's enough," I said. "That's more than enough." Oh. We drove back to Granville in the late afternoon light, the bare fields golden on either side of the county road, the sky going pink at the edges the way it does in December, when the day is ending cleanly. At the new shop, I started the stove in the corner that heated the main space and put on coffee and turned on the overhead lights. Chloe put on a canvas apron that was too big for her and stood at the new workbench looking at the walnut board. "Teach me something," she said. I came and stood beside her and picked up a hand plane and turned it over once in the way my father had turned one over before me, feeling the weight of it, checking the set of the blade. "Put your hand here," I said, "and here. Feel the grain first. Before you do anything else, you have to know which way the wood wants to go." She put her hands where I showed her, pressed her palms flat against the surface of the board, felt the grain running beneath her fingers. "Okay," she said. "I feel it." "Good." I stepped back. "Now go with it." She set the plane to the wood and pushed. and the first curl of walnut came up pale and clean over the blade, and the smell of it filled the new shop the way the smell of woodworking fills every space it enters completely, and without apology. And my daughter looked up at me with sawdust on her hands, and something in her face that I had been waiting to see for a long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. The grain of it running in the right direction, waiting for someone to go with it instead of against it. "What do we build first?" she asked. I looked around the new shop with its heavy timber framing and its east windows and its smell of clean wood and fresh beginnings. And then I looked at my daughter standing at the workbench with her mother's eyes and her own particular brand of hard-won resilience, and I thought about a walnut board that had been waiting 2 years for the right question. "Something that lasts," I said. She turned back to the wood and set the plane again, and the second curl came up even cleaner than the first, and outside the December sky finished going pink and turned to the deep, quiet blue of a winter evening in Ohio, and the stove ticked, and the coffee finished brewing, and the new shop settled around us like a thing that had been waiting a long time to be used properly. I had spent 11 years making myself invisible. It turned out the only person I had ever really been hiding from was myself. This is one of those grandpa stories that I never planned to tell. Not because it is too painful, but because for a long time I believed the people in it were still the same people I had always known. They were not. And neither was I. If there is a lesson in this family story, it is simply this: the people who matter most to you deserve the full version of who you are. Not the careful version. Not the version that keeps the peace by keeping itself small. God gave you a life to live honestly, not a performance to maintain indefinitely. I kept secrets with good intentions, and they almost cost me everything. Do not do what I did. Tell the people you love the truth before the truth finds its own way out. Every grandpa story is worth remembering. Begins with someone deciding that the people they love are worth protecting, even when protection is uncomfortable. Every family story worth telling ends not with perfection, but with honesty, finally arriving late and imperfect, and still somehow enough. This has been one man's family story. If any part of it reminded you of someone in your own life, I would be grateful if you left a thought in the comments below, shared it with someone who might need to hear it, and stayed close to this channel for the grandpa stories still to come. Thank you for being here until the very last word. It means more than I can say. One final note. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for the purpose of reflection and connection. If that is not the kind of content you are looking for, no hard feelings at all. There is something out there made just for you. Go find it.